I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Stephanie Amir. I am so sorry, I misspelled your name, Stephanie.
Well, that's okay.
Not because I don't know it. I'm so sorry. There's no E in her name. I apologize. So presenting for us today is Stephanie. Stephanie is currently finishing up her education and training towards becoming a licensed nutrition provider at San Francisco State University. She previously provided health education demonstrations in Community Health Resource Center health screening program, and her demos included education about cholesterol, glucose, and sodium.
Thank you, Twin, for the great intro. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. Today, we're going to be talking about emotional eating. And in my studies, I'm particularly interested in weight management and the connection between eating behaviors and health. So we're going to be touching on that today. And this is a general overview of the topics that we're going to be discussing. We're going to be talking about hunger. We're going to be defining emotional hunger and physical hunger, comparing and contrasting between them, seeing the differences, seeing the similarities. After that, we're going to be talking about the triggers for emotional eatings, some behaviors we see it manifest as, and any correlations with health conditions. Afterwards, we are going to have a section on strategies that you can practice if you experience emotional eating. And then we have a special section at the end that discusses emotional eating in adolescents, because I know a lot of you may have teenagers at home right now, and that may be something you're dealing with. And at the end, we have a section for Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to write them down. You can also write them in the chat, and we will be going over them in the end. So let's start out with talking about comfort foods. We all have those foods that we turn to when we're feeling a certain way. So those can be foods that we grew up eating. Maybe our parents cooked them growing up. They can be just foods that we like to eat. I just put two examples here. These are my comfort foods. I especially love mac and cheese. I like to eat it when I'm stressed. Usually I'll cook myself up a box and I will eat it in one sitting. Now, maybe your comfort foods are different. Maybe some of you also have mac and cheese as your comfort foods. But I would like you to take a moment and think about what are your comfort foods, and think about what would cause you to choose to eat those foods. And when you're eating them, think about what types of feelings would you be feeling maybe before, maybe during, and maybe after you're eating those foods. And I would really love to hear from you if any of you feel comfortable sharing just what your foods are, or maybe the feelings that you have associated with them. So if you feel comfortable, feel free. You can unmute yourself, or you can type in the chat box. I can see the chat box as well. So would anybody be interested in sharing?
Chips that go crunch.
Yeah, that one's a big one for me too.
Anything with a lot of salt in it.
Yeah, it's interesting. We do see that a lot of times those cravings are for more of the salty or very sweet foods.
A warm soup. That's a comfort food.
Yeah, it's definitely comforting, especially on a cold day, right? To share what they are feeling, like what kind of pushes them to choose to eat that comfort food.
Feeling lonely, feeling isolated, feeling sad, feeling powerless.
Yeah, those are definitely feelings that a lot of us experience. Okay, so we saw that comfort foods can come in many different shapes and forms, and we have different emotions associated with them. And comfort foods, they don't necessarily, like we said, they can be kind of like those sugary or crispy, salty foods, and they can also be virtually anything else. And we start to see the issue because those comfort foods are associated with feelings rather than strictly physical hunger. And that brings us to the definition of emotional eating, which is the practice of eating. And oftentimes we'll see it in larger quantities of food. And we eat when we experience feelings that are not strictly physical hunger, like I said. So here we have a little compare and contrast between emotional hunger versus physical hunger. And we just went over the definition for emotional hunger, which is eating in response to feelings that are not strictly physical. I said hunger, I should have said physiological hunger, because emotional hunger is a type of hunger, right? And physical hunger is more kind of that primal need for your body to have food. So we can see some differences between them. Emotional hunger, it usually comes in on all of a sudden. It's a craving. It's like, bam, I need to have those chips and I need to have it now. Whereas with physical hunger, it's going to be more of a gradual buildup, over time. And we may want to have the chips, but we could also do anything else. Maybe we could have the veggie rice bowl that we have in our fridge or leftovers from yesterday's dinner. And with emotional hunger, we see more of a hunger sensation in the mouth. Now, it's kind of difficult to explain what a hunger sensation in the mouth is, but if you've experienced it, you probably know what I'm talking about. And physical hunger, we would feel it more in our stomach. So we feel a hunger in our stomach, and our stomach may make some noises. It may grumble or rumble and tell us that we need that food. And with emotional hunger, that can happen any time of the day. It can happen even immediately after you ate a meal, maybe 15 minutes after you ate. It can happen maybe you wake up in the middle of the night and you're anxious and you really want to have those chips. And whereas with physical hunger, we see it more in regular intervals. So let's say I had my lunch at 1 o'clock today, then right around 5, I know and I expect that I'm going to start getting hungry again. And I'm going to hear that grumbling from my stomach. And then usually that'll go away. Once I eat, once I'm full, that goes away. Whereas emotional hunger can still linger. And I would say the main driving force between each of these is that with emotional hunger, we're eating to satisfy a craving. And that craving is a lot of it's in the brain. Whereas with physical hunger, we eat for physical satisfaction to satisfy that grumbling stomach. And I just want to emphasize here that emotional hunger is valid. It's not necessarily the root of all evil. We all experience emotional hunger at some point or other. However, we don't want to get to that point when we're using it as a coping mechanism for dealing with things rather than nurturing our bodies. And I just want to really quickly go over the physiological mechanism of hunger. So there's a lot of body systems and organs involved in that feeling that we call hunger. And this is kind of a very general overview. So hunger is controlled by a part of our brain called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus will send and receive different signals from messengers in the body. And we have two major hormones that regulate hunger. And they are called ghrelin, which is the hunger hormone, and leptin, which is also known as satiety hormone. And satiety just means fullness. So if we go back and we look at why we have that hunger, why does our body need food? So our body takes foods and it breaks it down so it can use its nutrients to provide energy for the cells of our body so the cells of our body can function. Now, after it's done that, it takes all our nutrients after we eat, breaks them down, pulls them into the cell, uses them. It's going to need some new energy because our cells need energy to function. So when that happens, we no longer have those nutrients in our bloodstream, and our blood sugar, we will see our blood sugar going down, and also our insulin levels will go down. And that signals to ghrelin, which, as we said, is the hunger hormone, and that is going to be released. And ghrelin sends a message to that hypothalamus part of our brain, and the hypothalamus signals to release something called neuropeptide Y. And those will give us that feeling that we're hungry, we need to consume food. And on the other end, we see satiety. So satiety is after we've eaten, we've just consumed food. And our body now needs, we have all this food nutrients at that point in our bloodstream, and our body will want to take it into the cells to provide them with the energy that they need. So at that point, our blood sugar will be high because we have a lot of time, we have nutrients that have carbohydrates in our bloodstream. And our insulin levels will also be high because a role of insulin is to help move those carbohydrates into the cell for energy. And those two rising, the blood sugar and the insulin, will signal for leptin to be released. Now, leptin is the polar opposite of ghrelin. Leptin is going to send a message to our hypothalamus again, and hypothalamus will release something called POMC. And those will signal that we are full. Our body does not need to eat more food. And that is when we get that feeling of fullness. And while I was researching this, I came across a really interesting study that actually saw that as people experience stressors in their lives, their ghrelin level, which is the hunger hormone, was actually found to be higher. So that just goes to show that even though it's a purely physiological mechanism of hunger, it can be influenced by some external factors. So why do we eat when we're not physically hungry? As we said, our brain has a huge role in this. We have a biological reason. So eating has been linked to chemicals, neurotransmitters called dopamine and serotonin. You may be familiar with these. They make us feel good. And when we eat, our brain will release dopamine and serotonin and we'll feel good. And in that way, our body will learn that when we eat, we feel good. And that's kind of like a conditioning that it'll want to eat because we want to feel good, right? And we also have an evolutionary reason. So back in the day, we were stressed. Maybe there was a danger of famine. We were scared that our body knew that maybe we might not get enough food. And it releases, when our body is stressed, it releases a hormone called cortisol. And one of the things cortisol does is it would make us crave food that are high in sugar, fat, and calories. Now, back in the day, this is an amazing mechanism, right? Because it keeps us from starving to death. But nowadays, a lot of times we have, in most cases, we will have an abundance of food. So we don't necessarily need that mechanism, but it's still around, just shooting out that cortisol and making us feel, crave those foods. And then we also have a cultural reason. So not just in American cultures, in many cultures, maybe some of you are from other different cultures and you've experienced this. And we associate eating with socializing, caring, and celebration. And if you think about, let's say, holiday meals, birthday dinners, all of those are kind of like celebratory, happy events that are associated with food. So here we can see these are some triggers that we see a lot as kind of triggering that emotional eating behavior. I talked a little bit about earlier about stress. We also see loneliness, frustration, boredom, depression, anxiety, sadness, and also procrastination. And procrastination is actually a really big one. If you've ever found yourself just trying to put off a task you need to do for work and then going back and forth to the fridge, that's emotional eating from procrastination. And this is not a comprehensive list. You may have triggers that are different than these. Maybe you have some of these triggers yourself, but there are just like many, many, many triggers. And this is some of the common ones. This is a diagram that I really, really like. It is called the comfort eating carousel. And it was created by Susan Albers. She is a psychologist and she wrote a few books on emotional eating. I have her books listed at the end if any of you are interested. And what she talks about is that basically emotional eating is very similar to substance abuse behaviors. So we can see that our carousel starts out here. So we experience stress or any other emotion that we just talked about in our triggers or maybe your personal triggers. So we experience stress and we need comfort from that stress, right? So we need comfort from that stress. We're going to cook that box of mac and cheese and eat it. And we eat that mac and cheese. And then we kind of feel that whoosh, we feel a temporary moment of comfort, of relief. We're feeling a little bit better now that we're eating it. However, those feelings aren't long lasting. And after a while, those positive feelings, they start to evaporate. And maybe we feel I ate that box of mac and cheese and maybe now I'm feeling bloated. Maybe I'm feeling uncomfortable physically, and maybe my problem is still there. My eating didn't solve the problem. And then our guilt starts to set in. And as our guilt starts to set in, guilt is actually another emotion, right? So we have that guilt and we need soothing from this new guilt. And as we need soothing from this new guilt, this causes, again, stress, and then the cycle starts back over again. So what's interesting to see is that in cases of substance abuse, like I mentioned, like alcohol or drugs, the cycle is very similar. It starts with needing relief from a certain emotion, and then we engage in this behavior. And this behavior only momentarily makes us feel better, but the cycle just keeps on going and going. Here we have some behaviors that we see a lot of times with emotional eating. So we have mindless snacking that may be just you're sitting in front of your laptop, like we can see in the picture, just shoving the chips in your mouth. And we also see binging a lot, which is eating large amounts of food, eating everything that's available to you, maybe everything that's in your fridge and your cabinet. And a lot of times, these behaviors, during these behaviors, we would choose foods that are on the more unhealthy side of the spectrum. Not always, but in a lot of cases, we do see that people tend to make unhealthier food choices. And this is kind of a double whammy because we make those unhealthy food choices and then we're eating those foods that are maybe very low in nutrients, but very high in calories. And as we're eating them, we can fill up on those foods. And then we may find ourselves skipping meals. And we skip meals, and because we ate all our junk food and we skipped our dinner, we may not be getting those nutrients that we need from our regular meals. So this could lead to just kind of like missing out on some essential nutrients that your body may need. Maybe you've been listening to me and maybe you have been like, yes, that is me. I am definitely an emotional eater. And maybe you're not sure, maybe some of it sounds like things you can connect with, some of it doesn't. So we just have some questions here that you can ask yourself if you want to check these behaviors in yourself. So you can ask yourself if you have been eating larger portions than usual, if you tend to eat at weird times. Let's say you wake up in the middle of the night and you need to eat something. If you feel out of control when food is around, if you feel like you don't control the food controls you. If you are feeling anxious about something specific, or maybe you've gone through some big event in your life and you're finding it a little hard to deal with. If your weight has changed recently. And also, if you've ever noticed any of your family members, if they exhibit these behaviors of eating to comfort themselves too. So we do see some health risks that are correlated with emotional eating behaviors. So we can see mental health effects. A lot of times that guilt can adversely affect social interactions. Maybe you don't want to be around people after you have those feelings. That can lead to some depression, isolation. And we do also see a correlation with eating disorders. Not always, but a lot of times people that do have eating disorders, they do exhibit emotional eating patterns. We also have a risk of weight gain. So a lot of times when we are engaging in emotional eating, then we could be taking in more calories than our body actually requires. And that can lead to weight gain. It can lead to obesity. And unfortunately, we do live in a weight-centric society. And a lot of times that can lead to feeling overwhelmed or maybe rejected in our society. And we also have some physical health risks. We have hypercholesterolemia, which is high cholesterol, hypertension, which is high blood pressure, heart disease. It could be chronic, it could be acute, something like a stroke, skeletal, muscular problems. Certain cancers are higher risk, respiratory dysfunction, diabetes, and sleep disorders. And this is just some research that looked at the different types of emotional eating triggers, and it categorized its subjects of the study into 3 different kinds. So EED are people who eat in response to depression. EEA are people who eat in response to anger or anxiety, and EEB are people who eat in response to boredom. So what the study found is that people who ate because of depression, so these people actually were found to have higher BMI, which is body mass index, lower psychological well-being, and emotional regulation. Emotional regulation is finding it challenging to maybe control your feelings, your emotions, and also eating disorders. And this one was found to be more common in women. People who ate in response to anger or anxiety, they were also found to have a higher BMI, lower psychological well-being and emotional regulation, and eating disorders. And this one was not gender specific. People who ate in response to boredom, this was not found to be correlated with higher BMI, but it still had correlations with lower psychological well-being, emotional regulation, and eating disorders. And it was also more common in women. So we can see that this study found that Emotional eating in response to depression and boredom were more gender specific, more found in women. And eating in response to depression, anger, or anxiety were correlated with higher BMI, and all of them were correlated with lower psychological well-being, emotional regulation, and eating disorders. Now, I just like you to think maybe you can identify these types in yourself, or maybe someone you know, maybe a family member, maybe a friend. Yeah, just think about that for a moment. So now that we've talked about the reasons, the triggers for emotional eating, the differences between physical eating, where it comes from, where it originates, I would like to go ahead with discussing some coping strategies that we can use if we experience emotional eating, if we get those cravings, either us or maybe we can share if we have a loved one that experiences emotional eating. So what happens with emotional eating is it occurs very similarly to a bell curve, which we can see here, a picture of a bell curve. And the x-axis represents time, and the y-axis will represent the craving signal. So we can see that our craving will start out low. It starts out right about here. And that's kind of maybe when you're feeling bored and you're starting to think about the chips. And then it intensifies really rapidly. Remember, I talked about like emotional eating. It's like emotional hunger. It comes on really rapidly. So that intensifies really rapidly. And at that point, it's like, I need to have the chips. I need to have them now. And afterwards, it will start to diminish. So what happens is if we are able to intervene anywhere around this area, a lot of times we'll find that our craving will naturally diminish after a certain amount of time. So what we want to do is, instead of either like to try to engage in it or fight it really hard, we just want to ride that wave. So we want to go with that wave and maybe practice one of the strategies that I'll show you in a moment. And we're going to ride that wave until hopefully our craving will start to die down and our brain will adjust to a new signal. And the first method I would like to share with you is a distraction method. So to prepare for this, you can just take out a piece of paper or your phone and make a list. Make a list of 3 things that you like to do that are not associated with food. So that could be maybe texting a friend, taking a bath, maybe reading a book, just anything really that you enjoy doing. And it needs to be something, like I said, pleasurable, you enjoy doing it. And when you feel that craving hit, you can pull out your list and look at the activities that you listed. And at that point, you want to engage in one of them. And we engage in one of them, and that's what I was talking about earlier. We want to disrupt that signal. So once we engage in one of the activities, we do that for 5 to 10 minutes. And we can even put a timer on our phone if we want to. Just do that activity for a little while. And afterwards, once we're done with the activity, we reevaluate our craving and our feelings. And a lot of times we will see that our craving has reached that bottom of the wave and it'll actually diminish. And maybe we don't need those chips so bad anymore. The second method is the postponing method. And it has some similarities and some differences to the distraction method. And we can use this if we get a craving, a food craving, when we're in the middle of something like a job or a chore. Let's say maybe you came home from work and you find a pile of dishes in the sink and your teenager was supposed to have done those dishes before you came home, but they didn't do the dishes. And now you're so tired and you're so cranky and you need to do the dishes and you just really, really need those chips. So instead of going and having those chips and maybe like yelling at your teenager, we want to engage in opposite action. And when we do that, we do the dishes. We finish those dishes. And after we finish those dishes, we ask ourselves again, where is my craving at on the bell curve? And then here again, a lot of times as time passes, we will see that craving diminish. So our key phrase here is not now, maybe later. We're not forbidding ourselves from having those chips or whatever else you would be craving. We just tell ourselves, okay, we're going to do this chore, we're going to do this task. And once we complete it, if we still want the chips, we can have them, but we need to complete the chore first. This one is a personal favorite of mine. It is called the STOP method, and it is adapted by a method created by Deepak Chopra. He's a very well-known meditator and author. I'll just go through these letters. Each letter stands for something, and these are things that you would do when a craving hits. So S is for stop what you are doing, and then T stands for engaging in 20 seconds of slow, deep breathing. And while we are doing that, we want to observe any sensations that we have in our body, any thoughts or feelings that we have going on. And after that, we note those things that we observed and we proceed with awareness. And in a lot of times, we're able to make better decisions. And I would like to ask you all to invite you to take a moment and participate with this exercise, in this exercise now with me together. So I will guide us all. I would like us to please stop what we are doing. And then I invite you all to close your eyes and begin to take slow, deep breaths. Just begin to take those breaths in through the nose and out through the mouth. And just continue with the deep breaths. And as we are doing that, start scanning from the top of your body, from your head to your toe, and note any sensations that we have going on. If you have any feelings, any tensions in your body, just make a little mental note of those things going on. Continue with the breaths, a few more breaths. And now as you open your eyes, I'd like you to think about the exercise we just did. And remember those feelings, those tensions that you observed. And maybe you found it a little bit like difficult or weird or uncomfortable to practice this, and that's okay. Because the methods here, maybe you don't connect with all of them. And maybe it feels weird, maybe you've meditated before, maybe you haven't. But I really encourage you to experiment with all three of these methods and see what works for you. And like I said, they don't always work 100% of the time, and they don't work the same for everyone. It's really individualized. So I do encourage you to experiment with them and see what works best for you. And here, these are just a few more things to try. So meditation apps, if you did enjoy the stop exercise we just did, I really recommend Headspace. It is a paid app, and they have really great single meditations and courses. There's a course that I like about controlling cravings. And then we also have Calm. It's very similar to Headspace. We have an app called Plum Village. That one is free. And mindfulness movement has also been shown to be beneficial. Things like Tai Chi, yoga, self-massage. You can find YouTube videos, just follow along with them. And journaling, finally, can also help. So if you're feeling a craving, you can just jot down or maybe draw whatever you're feeling inside and what you are craving. And a lot of times that can help us identify patterns, and helping us identify those patterns will help us identify those triggers that we have and make us more aware. Then we have this amazing resource, which is the Emotional Eating Support Group at CHRC. It is a 12-week class series, and it happens in small groups. And during that time, you're going to really hone in on those emotional eating behaviors and develop your toolbox for how to deal with them. And it's all done in a really supportive, non-judgmental environment. So if that sounds like something that you may be interested in, feel free to call this number over here or email. You can also email, Twin gave her email at the beginning of the invitation, so you can also email that email or the email here. And this is just highly, highly recommended. Also, if you have any questions about this, again, feel free to reach out. So now I want to go on to the final portion, which is emotional eating in adolescence. And adolescence, teenage years, it can be a crazy, confusing, emotional time. And during the past 2 years, due to COVID, we've actually been seeing a rise in these emotional eating behaviors in teenagers that we hadn't previously seen. So both male and female adolescents, they can both develop emotional eating patterns, just like adults. And research found that actually over 60% of children between the ages of 5 and 13, just like 13 is like barely even a teenager, but they've already been found to eat in response to mood changes. And as they grow older, as they enter those adolescent years, those behaviors start to ingrain themselves as coping mechanisms. They can ingrain themselves and continue into adulthood. And in adolescence, just like adults, emotional eating has been linked to poor emotional regulation and also negative body image for them. Here we have some signs and symptoms you can look out for. We see a lot of overeating, constant hunger, preoccupation or obsession with food, picky eating habits, worries about not getting enough food. Now, all these symptoms, they can also be signs of either mental or physical health conditions. So it's always recommended to first check with your primary care provider and see if there's anything else going on before we get to treating that as emotional eating. Here we have just some recommendations for do and don'ts, just some general guidelines. If you have a teenager or a child, even at home. So for do, we really want to model those healthy eating habits. Children learn a lot by observation, even when they're teenagers. So we want to practice what we preach. So even if we're saying one thing, if we act a different way, then a lot of times our children can pick up on that. And we want to emphasize that food for nutrition and don't want to correlate it with, for example, rewards or achievements. We want to think of other prizes to reward our children for those. We also want to encourage discussion with our teenagers. We want them to feel comfortable sharing things with us. And we want to validate those feelings if they choose to share. Also, during those teenage years, they go through many changes. They go through weight changes, mood changes, sleep changes. And as family members, we really want to normalize those and address them as they occur. So we don't want our teenager to think that something's inherently wrong if they experience one of those. Here we have some don'ts. We do not want to police our child's eating. That's basically exactly what it sounds like. We don't want to tell them, eat this, don't eat that. We don't want to use food in celebrations and rewards. And we don't want to discourage them if they do choose to share with us. We want to, even if like some of the things they share may seem silly to us, for them, it could be huge. So we really want to avoid invalidating their feelings. And we also don't want to comment negatively if we see any changes in their weight. So we need some outside help, and there are trained professionals that can help with emotional eating in children and teenagers. And these are some questions that you can ask if you're considering seeking professional help, if your child is sneaking around or doesn't want to eat in front of you, if they've developed negative body image that affects their daily life, if they seem maybe depressed, unhappy, if they're isolating in the room, if they've had any major weight changes in a short amount of time. And finally, if for any reason at all you're having a hard time dealing with them on your own, then there is a help out there and there are resources, and you do not have to go through this alone. So here I've listed just some additional resources if you want to do some further reading or practicing. I mentioned earlier Susan Albers, and she wrote these 2 books. She wrote 50 Ways to Soothe Yourself Without Food, has a lot of really useful suggestions to try there. And then if you have a teenager, there is a workbook, Eating Mindfully for Teens. You can give it to them to go through. And these 2 books are available on Amazon or at most online bookstores. And then we have Headspace, which is the meditation app that I mentioned earlier. I did mention Coping with Cravings. Of course, there's another course on mindful eating. And if you would like to try some yoga, I recommend Yoga with Cassandra on YouTube. She has a lot of really great flows for both beginners, intermediates, advanced, and it's really fun to just follow along. I always personally feel really relaxed after I do one of her videos. So if you just want to take a screenshot of this with your phone or write this down, feel free to do so. And here is the contact info for CHRC, Community Health and Resource Center. It's a great place. As I said, I do volunteer work with them. And this is the contact info. There is a QR code here. If you want to just take a picture with your phone, it'll take you directly to the website. And the website, it's also, you can see the address here. This is the same one. There is also an email address here, a phone number if you have any questions at all about what we talked about. If you're interested in the emotional eating course, which I mentioned earlier, you can definitely contact with these information. And before we end, I would like to leave you with this quote. It is by Deepak Chopra, who creator of the STOP method. The space between hunger and eating, where you make the choice you want to make, isn't empty. It's filled with awareness. And we can really see awareness as the key. And once we practice, once we work on that, we'll find we have that better connection with our body, and we're able to improve those eating behaviors. We're able to feel more in control, more connected. So thank you again for joining us. And I would like to open the floor up for some questions.
We also have Elena joining us. She is a registered dietitian at Community Health Resource Center. And Elena's camera may not be working, but I hope that her mic is. But if you have any questions in the next 8 minutes, please feel free to share, and feel free to also share your personal experiences with emotional eating.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Valerie.
Yeah. I have noticed an increase in fear around eating. You know, eating is something we have to do. It's a job. and our health is our responsibility. But I find that people get very anxious about doing it right. And that means that they're afraid to eat certain things, and they have beliefs around which things their bodies need more than other things. And the stress level seems to be very high. How would you approach your friends or your family members who are experiencing this kind of fear, and try to reduce that so that they're not difficult to be around?
All of those, we're seeing a lot of like extreme cases that we try to completely eliminate gluten, completely eliminate dairy. And it's really difficult to do, and people get so stressed and overworked about that. Mm-hmm. So something I do recommend looking into, or maybe even recommending to your friends and family, is experimenting with intuitive eating. And intuitive eating is all about listening to your body. And when we listen to our body, again, this is something that takes a lot of practice. It's so hard to disconnect because we can't just cut out food like we do other substances, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we want to, with intuitive eating, we want to try to better listen to our body and ask it, what does it need? And instead of coming from a very judgmental approach towards ourselves of we can't eat this, we can't eat that, seeing what we need and trying to do that. So maybe if you could recommend that to your family members to try, or to look into, that may be useful for them. I'm going to see if Elena has any suggestions to add.
Mm-hmm. Hi, everyone. I apologize. My camera doesn't work today, and I'm not sure why, which is concerning because I've tried 3 times to do different things. But so I'm here, and I was listening to the presentation. I think Stephanie did a very good job, a great job to provide information. I'm more than happy to support with the answering questions. So it is a great question, and I think it's a great problem of today's society, and I see that a lot with my patients in my office. It's a lot of confusion about nutrition because we have this abundance of information, and everybody seems to be an expert on nutrition. Everybody can write an article online or have a blog or have a website, and it's just like, a lot of people take pieces of research, or they read something somewhere, and then they take that because somehow resonates with them, and maybe that diet or maybe eliminated dairy or gluten work for them, and now they feel like I should tell everybody that this is the approach to whatever. And the reality is that we have different bodies, we have different needs, and there's no definition of a perfect healthy diet. I tell my patients all the time, if healthy diet, it's healthy for you in the moment you are with the health conditions you have. So it's a very difficult topic, because how do you do that when you feel like a family member has this extreme approach to diet, and you think that maybe it's not healthy, and it might not be. So kind of like trying to, I always say, simplifying the message. I mean, a good thing is like to talk with a nutrition professional, to suggest, like, have you talked with the dietitian or that is specialized in nutrition, or sometimes providing a website that, like Harvard Health, they have those health letters that are very credible, with credible nutrition information. Sometimes there are things like Nutrition Action, that's part of the Center of Science in the Public Interest. They break down in easy kind of in an easy way the nutrition information that we know it's valid and it's been shown by science to work. So they debulk all those myths around diet that circulate online.
Elena?
Yes?
I like to ask a follow-up question, really asking for an example when you mentioned diets or nutrition is not a one-size-fits-all. It's really depending on you. Could you give an example of perhaps a food trend that might even be dangerous to some people if they aren't talking to a nutritional professional?
Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of examples, and I had actually an example in my office maybe 3 years ago or so. It was pre-pandemic. That, you know, they're very popular, especially for weight loss right now. The Atkins diet or modified ketogenic diet, which is not necessarily the classic ketogenic diet, is very high in fat and it's moderate in protein and very, very low in carbohydrate. But sometimes people nowadays, to make it more sustainable, that classic ketogenic diet is very hard to follow long term. And there are a lot of people following a modified ketogenic diet, which means they really overdo the protein, because with that you get more fat, and then you really limit the carbohydrates to the point that you barely eat some vegetables and no fruit, no grains, no legumes, you know, very limited, those plant foods. And the problem with this diet is, like, this person, it really helped him to lose weight, but he actually had chronic kidney disease, stage 3 to 4. It was kind of in between. And a diet that's that high in protein really puts a lot of strain on somebody with CKD stage 3 or 4. So it was not a diet appropriate for him, even though it helped him lose weight. But longer term, as a sustainable approach, that was not a good diet for him. Plus, you know, somebody again with chronic constipation being on that diet, it's not going to work because you really don't have enough fiber from those plant foods. And they might help you, let's say, with your weight problem temporary, but it can really exacerbate other things that you have in the background. And there are more examples than this. These were just a couple of things that came in my mind. But there are more examples of when it's just a single diet that maybe it's very popular or work for a lot of people may not be actually the healthiest one for you.
Yeah. And I think keto is super trendy right now. I see it so much. And like Elena says, it doesn't suit everyone. Maybe it works well from some people, but it's also really difficult to sustain. Like some of these ultra trendy diets, like right now it's keto, it used to be Atkins. Like those are very difficult to sustain. So they may not necessarily be the right choice. And I think that a lot of times people may think, okay, this is the only thing I can do to lose weight. But if that's what they're interested in, losing weight, sometimes there is a variety of approaches that can work. And if they talk to a nutrition professional, as Elena said, then maybe they could help them find what works best for their individualized needs.
Yeah, I had a woman a few years ago that she was doing ketogenic diet for 5 years, but the way, because again, it's so hard to stick with it, she couldn't stick with it, but she was actually alternating periods of basically strict ketogenic diet and then binging on carbs. She would have 3 months of binging on carbs. And, you know, honestly, I was wondering, it's like, is she going to develop an eating disorder just following this diet? Because she would just go through 3 months of like eat as many carbs as you can and then be strict again for 6 months and then go back to binging on carbs and, you know, creating those, what we talked about in the emotional eating presentation, those unhealthy behaviors around food, right? When you sit down and you just can't stop and control yourself. And that was not a good, in my opinion, sustainable diet, even though she felt was sustainable because she was on it for 5 years.
Yeah, and that's really falling out of touch with what your body needs.
Yeah, exactly. Not that much intuitive eating in this particular thing. Intuitive eating, as Stephanie was mentioning, is just that kind of, you eat until your body feels good and you eat the food that your body tells it's good for you. I mean, yeah, you might like fried foods, but you know that after eating those, you have this horrible heartburn and you can't sleep well that night. So intuitive eating also kind of tells you, you know, those are not the foods to engage or eat that often or that much because it doesn't make you feel good. And then intuitive eating also tells you how much to eat because you want to eat to feel good physically and mentally, right? So this is kind of the karma of intuitive eating.
Thank you so much, Elena. And thank you so much, Stephanie. I really appreciate all of the questions and discussion we had surrounding this topic. I wish that we had more time.
Thank you for participation. It's great for us to be able to, come out with those health education, nutrition related topics to really, what we're trying to do is to simplify this nutrition information going around and create simple messages of what, what healthy means for everyone. And again, sometimes as I mentioned, sometimes people need more on individualized approach, but I hope that everybody feels that at CHRC, we're trying to create a safe environment for credible, valuable nutrition information, because I know there's a lot of confusion going around.
Yeah, and thank you everybody at CHRC for hosting me and having this presentation on this important topic. And thank you everybody for attending today.
Have a good night, everyone. Bye.
Bye, thank you everybody.